Hello, everyone. Welcome to Pro Panels by Inside Towers. I'm John Celentano, business editor at Inside Towers, the newsletter that magically appears in your inbox every morning with news and information about the wireless infrastructure business. I will be your host and moderator for today's presentation. Our topic today is 5G infrastructure strategy, and it couldn't be more timely. The U.S. wireless industry consists of a lot of moving parts. We've just completed the first round of a record-setting FCC auction for highly valued mid-band spectrum in the C-band and CBRS before that. There's a lot of buzz around new technologies like Open RAN, mobile edge computing, and network slicing. New funding programs have been rolled out for improving wireless connectivity, especially in rural areas. We have a new administration and a changing of the guard at the FCC. More important, with fourth quarter 2020 earnings just being reported, we're starting to get a read on year-end 2020 results from the carriers, tower companies, and their vendors, along with their outlook for 2021 and related capital spending plans. And on top of that, we're still in a pandemic. Certainly a lot to sort through. The big question is what to expect and what to watch for with 5G infrastructure deployments in 2021. I'm joined today by a distinguished panel of industry veterans to help bring some perspective to the topic. Before I introduce the panel, a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded today, Wednesday, January 27th, 2021, and is scheduled for 1 hour, give or take a few minutes. We will notify you when the recording is posted to our website. All attendees are on mute. However, we welcome your questions at any time during the discussion. You can submit a question via the Q&A tab on the Zoom menu bar at the bottom of your screen. We will get to as many questions as time allows. Know that we will respond to all questions afterwards and we'll post the panel's answers to our website at a later date. And we would also like your feedback on this call. Be on the lookout for a couple of audience polls as we go along. Now let's meet the panel. Joining us today are Danny Agresta with APC Towers, Jennifer Alvarez from Aurora Insights, Scott Jackson from Graybar, and Jim Neuens from VIAVI Solutions. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I'd like to give each of you a chance to, for us to get to know you. Why don't you each give us the high-level pitch on your company, a little background on your experience in the industry. Danny, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So again, my name is Danny Agresta. I'm the founder and CEO of APC Towers. The APC Towers was started 7 years ago, along with my partner, Mark Cravens. We've both been in the industry and the infrastructure side for each of us over 25 years. APC Towers is based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. We have offices in Ohio, Utah, and Texas. We are a private national mid-size tower developer that operates in 38 states currently. We are predominantly a build-to-suit company. We work with carriers and get contracted by carriers to build towers. We do dabble in the acquisition side, but not much. Most of our portfolios are organic, just like I said, all build-to-suits. And we also do rooftop, we market rooftops, we work with government properties, and we provide site development services.
Great. Jennifer, how about you?
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Jennifer Alvarez. I'm a co-founder and CEO of Aurora Insight. We are a startup. We've been around for about 4 years. And what we're doing is measuring the radio frequency environment. And from these measurements, deriving data analytics and insights. Now, our customers are across the wireless industry, from MNOs, MSOs, tower companies, equipment manufacturers. They use this specific information to optimize their capital deployments and increase their revenues.
Excellent. Scott.
Scott Jackson, I'm the National Market Manager of Graybar. I have what's considered our broadband business. So that's both wireline and wireless. If you don't know Graybar, we're one of the big nationals. So we have like 290 locations around the country where we stock material, plus big zones and service centers, et cetera. Happy to be here. Thank you so much.
We're happy to have you. Thank you. And Jim, a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jim Neuens. I'm with VIAVI Solutions. I'm the general manager of the wireless instrumentation business at VIAVI. VIAVI is a leader in global leader in field instrumentation for contractors, system integrators, service providers in the maintenance and installation of networks throughout the world. Thank you.
Excellent. So let's jump into it. You know, we've been living with 5G for a while now, and we're seeing progress. There's a lot of promo and hype around it as well. But would you say that you know, the carrier 5G rollout is progressing as you expected? And Danny, you're on the front line. Why don't you kick us off with what you're seeing from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we wanted to talk about just where we've been the last 12 months and kind of the progress of 5G is, I'll start by saying outside of work, when I'm with my friends, I really don't try to talk about telecom ever. But it never fails because they always want to talk about it, especially now that, you know, through the playoffs for football, college and pro, every commercial is either a beer commercial or a 5G commercial. And so they can't help themselves. So they think 5G is everywhere and it's great. And now that all the phones were now, you know, that came out were enabled, 5G enabled. So they think everything's 5G. And so it's kind of hard to separate 5G and 4G. But what I explained to them, like all the other Gs that we've had in the past, that this G brings a lot of excitement, probably much more than some of the other Gs, but it's going to take some time. This 5G network, this new standard that is set for, you know, ultra fast, low latency is going to take time. And if you just look back the last 12 months, if you start with that, this is a new standard, and then you layer that with the merger between, you know, Sprint and T-Mobile that took, you know, 2 years to come to fruition, and then you add this horrific pandemic that we're still in the middle of, and then the carriers kind of pivoting and not being as aggressive in their deployments as they were in the past years, all kind of hoarding their cash a little bit for the C-band auction, which you just mentioned earlier, which is, you know, obviously reported to set records at $100 billion. It's taking time to roll out. And if you look at an operational aspect of it with the 5G rollouts, all those things I just mentioned kind of created a ripple effect the last 12 months for us, at least, and I can only speak for us. We had some kinks in the supply chain for sure. We had, you know, for steel, for example, was you know, punched out for another 4 to 6 weeks, and then even the simple things like ice bridges or fence postings, you know, the manufacturing of those took longer. So my point is that all the things that took place had a ripple effect throughout our operations and working with the carriers, especially when on their side of ordering their equipment. And then on top of that, regarding the build outs, we had challenges with labor, right? With, you know, with potential COVID, them missing out, you know, potentially a couple of weeks through whatever protocol that they were using, transportation, the headaches behind all that. And then, you know, obviously the skeleton crews in the municipalities, which delayed permitting, zoning, being able to get a hold of anybody. So if you ask, you know, if you're to go back to your question, how is 5G progressing? If you talk about the deployment side of the business, which is what I live and breathe on, I mean, those are some of the things that have kind of, you know, some of the barriers that we faced so far in the last 12 months.
Scott, Danny mentioned the supply chain. What are you seeing from your side as a major supplier to the industry in terms of rollouts and delays or any issues related to that?
Well, the one thing driving a lot of it is the fiber optics. So demand is outpacing supply, okay, right now. And from a distribution, we're, again, one of the big, large nationals, so we get a certain amount of allocation. So that trickles down to all the other products. And then, of course, with COVID, you don't want it in the factory. That could shut things down, but they're managing through that. And with the carriers, they generally buy direct fiber optics, so it's big contractual things. So the long haul fiber is not what I'm talking about here, but or they'll have a directed buy. You contractor will go buy at this price under our contract for this project. So what it comes down to is what I consider the last mile of the network. And in a fiber to the home scenario, that would be to a home or a business, et cetera, with fiber. In this case, it's a tower or it's a small cell. So you have last mile fiber, and that could be a pre-connectorized type of fiber, or that could be a drop reel where you cut it to a certain length. And then that begets all the ancillary equipment that goes with it, handholds, vaults, and et cetera, which would generally be at the tower company or the tower erector or contractor, if you will. That's that discretionary spend. So in general, we're able to manage a lot of the smaller stuff, but fiber is definitely under allocations, and all that drop cable does fit into that. I hope I answered that. Answered your question.
Sure. I mean, are you seeing, given the last mile, are you seeing, you know, the segmentation of that fiber? We're now, you know, we've had front haul for a while, from the baseband units at the bottom of the tower to the radio units at the top, but now we're talking about mid haul between some intermediate distribution points that are going to be coming. Are you seeing any of that yet, or is that still to be more of an open RAN type of architecture?
Kind of interesting. So I remember with Danny talking about, he talks to his friends about 5G. I talk to my friends because they want to ask, we're in the middle of it, and I just say, hey, the difference between 4G and LTE is you have longer radios with LTE and shorter wires, whether it's fiber optics, coaxial, et cetera. I said the 5G is changing that whole dynamic. You have longer wires and shorter radios, right? So you can get all the latency, and that means a lot of fiber optics, right?
There you go.
And so that definitely has an impact on, as a lot of contractors are dealing with fiber more and more. So what we'll see is a lot of jumpers at a tower and a lot of sales of that nature for maybe a fixed 5G millimeter wave, a little bit of 5G upgrades, but it's the training as well. So let's not forget the training of the VIAVI gear that's coming up, right? That's test. And then they need to know how the pole attachments work to the small cell, how it hooks up, and how does the fiber hook? How do you even ground fiber? A lot of people didn't realize they've got a ground fiber as well. So there's a lot of training. We at Graybar, we've got a program called the Graybar Training Alliance, where it started really great, and then COVID hit and it kind of shut things down and everything's virtual, but it was a hands-on training, trying to satisfy that in the industry. But we're seeing contractors dealing more and more with fiber where they weren't under the 4G architecture as much. So.
Very good. Okay. Jennifer, you must get involved in early stages from a network planning perspective, customers using your data to plan their networks, the locations, or find out what's out there. How does what you do play into all of this?
Well, you're right. We can help our customers with their RF network planning and also competitive assessment. So at a first glance, you know, what are my competitors doing? Where are they deployed in a market? Like specifically, where are their base stations for specifically LTE? So looking at the coverage in the different market segments that are being covered by the competitors' LTE. Now let's look at 5G and see how they're rolling out. So from there, you can get a hotspot analysis, a zone analysis of where there are really competitive areas where you need to make sure that your services are going to be superior because there's a lot of competition in those areas. And we can identify areas where there's a lot of demand, so a lot of traffic demand for data, but it's just not being served well. And so there's another high priority tower build zone, we call it, where you really want to be able to deploy new cells and tower infrastructure to serve those areas. So it really is a tool that can be used for competitive assessment, but also the precise planning of your RF network elements.
So you can tell us where the infrastructure is and where it is not and where it needs to be.
Exactly, all three of those.
Very good. So Jim, you know, with fiber getting such emphasis these days as part of the, and we like to use the phrase too, it takes a lot of wires to make wireless work. In this case, it's fiber. But, you know, tower technicians these days have to be very, very much more schooled in RF, fiber optics, and the like. And so give us a sense of what you're seeing in terms of demand for that, as Scott alluded to, that additional training and education in terms of what it takes to deploy fiber at a wireless site.
Yeah, so that was going to comment on Scott's comment, because he hit it right on the head, right? The fiber density in the network now is getting much higher. Technicians need to be schooled in that. VIAVI's approach to that is to automate as much of that as possible. So it's a little simpler to test the fibers, if you will, but you still need the skills to deal with splicing. You still need the skills to deal with aligning the fibers correctly. We've got passive WDM systems being deployed all over the US right now. And frankly, one of the most common issues we see in the field is they get the fibers mixed up. They're terminating radio 1 with radio 2's fiber, or sector A alphas with sector betas. And they really spend a lot of time chasing that down. And so there's a couple aspects to it. There's one is learning how to deal with fiber, but then secondarily, it's also the configuration management of not only the build-to diagrams, but also the deployment then and the building on the tower itself. So we see opportunities across the board there to help.
And you offer training programs to educate and bring these field techs up to speed on this, right?
Yeah, there's training sessions available through people like Graybar. Some of the rental companies have training classes. VIAVI has training classes. And then with the advent of things like Team and Zoom, you are even seeing the build out of what we call informal lunch and learn sessions, which are actually free. They're not necessarily certification training, but they are very oriented to specific aspects of installation and construction of mobile networks. And VIAVI certainly has a number of lunch and learns that go on all the time, every other week, that are offered for folks, again, learning how to do some of the more visceral things associated with the 5G deployment.
I would think one of the lags on the overall deployment is getting the field forces up to speed on the skill levels they need to do the job. I mean, there's a lot of people required, and we've written about shortages of manpower, and so that's a long cycle, actually.
Yeah, it is. It clearly is. And again, you could come at that from a couple different approaches, right? In order to realize the promise of 5G, the deployments in the US are going to have to accelerate dramatically, which is going to have to accelerate onboarding of new technicians, which means we've got to figure out a way to make them proficient much quicker. I read an article, I don't know, it was a couple months back, maybe it was Ericsson, stated that the 5G network at the level to meet the promise that has been hyped in the press and even amongst the service providers, right? Well, so VIAVI is coming at that from a slightly different angle. We're working to make the test instrumentation a whole heck of a lot smarter, drive a lot more automation in the process, and so the technician becomes the hands, and the instrumentation takes on more of an interpretation role, a coordination role, and does a lot of the configuration management, things that take time to teach technicians. We try to automate as much of that as we can. That's our approach to helping.
Excellent, good. Well, we should get the audience involved here and pose a question to them and see how they respond. We can post our first audience poll. Audience, go ahead and vote. We'll give you a couple of seconds to look at the questions and come back with some responses. So, in the meantime, while we're waiting for those results, we are seeing or getting feedback from at least AT&T and Verizon, who've reported their year-end results already in terms of where they see themselves going with their spending plans and their progress with their deployments. We certainly see a lot more small cells being in the mix, and fiber. Both AT&T and Verizon have indicated that fiber is going to be a big part of their build out, including more of their own fiber to towers. So let's see what our results look like. So the question was, what are the biggest hurdles to 5G deployments? Supply chain delivery delays, local permitting and licensing, carrier capital expenditures, or shortage of field technicians. And it looks like local permitting and licensing is seen to be one of the biggest issues. And behind that, carrier CapEx. So does that jive with what you're running into? Danny, is that kind of aligned with what you're seeing out in the field?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I really didn't dive into the whole municipality and zoning barrier, but I mean, that has been, it's a challenge when they're there every day of the week, right? So, you know, the last 12 months, it's a big challenge. And, you know, it just shows you the importance of a network that can handle everyone being remote. So I think it just plays well into 5G, to be honest with you, because I don't think anybody, I mean, no matter what they say, no one was ready for the bandwidth and execution and the platforms that they had internally to handle the traffic and or you know, the data that they needed to get this done.
Yeah, I think you're going to see a lot of municipalities and the carriers that are on opposing sides in the lobbying area. And I think they'll come together and work that out. I had the privilege of serving on the board of directors of the Fiber Broadband Association. So we had municipalities that did fiber to the home that were members, and we also had the carrier type network operators. So this particular pole attachment issue that's been constantly in our industry news is a very, we had to walk a fine line for that because of both sides. And there's two sides to every story, and the truth is generally somewhere in between. So I think they'll work that out.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'll add is you're right, because like you have the government, the municipality will say that the customer, the provider is not respecting the right of way and or the aesthetics or following the process and trying to do something more streamlined. And then and the folks on this side of the fence will say that they're overcomplicating everything, right? So you know, it's kind of to your point where both parties are going to have to bridge that. But you know, there's two sides to every story, as you said. But
you know, we've heard anecdotes about streamlining the process, make it a little more automated and the like. But I think that's worked to some extent and help move things along. But it's clearly the pandemic has prompted a revamp of the process to try and keep things rolling. But okay, very good. We have a question in from our audience. Can the panelists walk us through the number of macro sites in the U.S. and what percentage have new antennas supporting 5G? And then, you know, what the impact of the mid-band auctions, C-band and CBRS will have on new antennas or new infrastructure that's required. Danny, maybe you could take a look at that also, or respond to that.
yeah, I mean, I'll comment on the C-band with regards to number of antennas and stuff. I won't be able to answer that question. But with regarding the C-band and the auctions, I can tell you that one of the questions that we were asked as a panel was, what the carriers are mainly, what are they mainly investing with their infrastructure and or their network infrastructure? And as you all have seen, between the CBRS and the C-band, which is not finalized yet, I mean, the C-band alone, as I mentioned earlier, will be $100 billion, and that's including, even if it's 80+ billion, it's going to be 20 billion plus to just clear it, and for the bidders, the winning bidders to operate. And I can't blame them, because I mean, I think, you know, it's some of the articles I've read, this mid-band spectrum, which is the best bang for range and speed, is the oceanfront property of spectrum, right? And so, I mean, that is why everyone is trying to gobble this up. And so the question is, who's gobbling it up, right? So the reports read that Verizon and AT&T are assumed to be the big spenders. And the reason those two need to be the big spenders is because they have to cut the gap between them and T-Mobile, who has the abundance of spectrum that they received in the Sprint deal, right? And so we are, as I told you, we do build the suits, and we're a T-Mobile. You know, we do all the carriers, but we're pretty heavy with the T-Mobile build the suits. And I can tell you from, all the sites that in the 38 different states that we work in, we're receiving the 2.5 and 600 amendments across the board. And so they're full going, in deployment. So with regard to the C-band spectrum and why and the purpose and who's going to benefit, those are, a few of the answers.
Jennifer, yeah, go
there.
ahead, Jennifer, comment on that.
Thanks. Yeah, on the C-band and CBRS. So CBRS, we're seeing new deployments all across the Midwest. So that seems like the GAA and the PAL is really picking up this CBRS activity. And as Danny pointed out, the midband is really the sweet spot for propagation and for coverage, but it's not without challenges. So CBRS, there's the spectrum sharing, and the C-band that was just auctioned, spectrum needs to be cleared, and after it's cleared, it has to not interfere with the downlink stations, the ground stations for satellites that had to be moved up to 4.0 to 4.2 gigahertz. So there really are still some challenges, technical challenges and regulatory challenges for having this transition of the satellite companies to that higher band and then populating that C-band that was just auctioned.
Any estimate, Jennifer, how long the lag may be between the auction awards and until we actually get to a point where we're ready to deploy? I mean, it seems like there's a lot of work to be done in between.
A lot of work. The spectrum has to be cleared, first of all, and then there are some deadlines for A, B, and C blocks to be cleared. So there's spectrum clearing, then there's all the network planning that has to go on. And the network planning can't be just, let's put a new C-band deployment everywhere that we have an LTE deployment. That just wouldn't be capitally efficient. Right. So there is a lot of network planning that has to go on between now and then.
And we would expect, I know there's some radio manufacturers have indicated they're ready to go with radios in those frequency bands, but I think the ecosystem that needs to be built up and developed for these bands is still in works. So again, it'll take some time. Jim?
John, maybe a quick comment here. So the C-band will represent the first new installations of 5G short of the millimeter wave stuff that's going on sporadically throughout the states. And the thing to watch here is, and when you're talking about infrastructure, is the entire front haul infrastructure is going to change from the low band to the mid band, right? The low band looks, the front haul infrastructure looks a lot like 4G. As we move into mid band and we get into MIMO antennas, active antennas, and we get into higher channel bandwidths, which is, why it's the waterfront property of mobile carriers, is going to drive the transition of the front haul from the legacy into the new wave, and O-RAN and things of that nature are going to come to fold. And so that front haul network, instead of being a passive WDM network in the future, is now going to be a routed and switched network to feed the cellular base station to radio transmission and data content. So that will be a big upheaval and a significant change that people are going to have to deal with as we move into C-band.
So what kind of impact do you think this has on what it's going to cost to deploy all of this? I mean, we saw in the last couple of days, AT&T and Verizon have talked about they talk about aggregate CapEx. They don't break out their wireless. We make an attempt at doing that, but they're pretty flat year to year in terms of their spend. But Verizon says they have more efficiencies, and so they're getting a bigger bang for the buck. And I take their word on that. But all of this new frequencies in multi-bands, mid, low, mid, and high band, it's going to drive a lot of expenditures that we've not seen in prior generations of deployments, which have been fairly well defined in terms of the frequencies that are used, right? Jim, would you say that's true?
Yeah, that is true, but it's also going to open up new business opportunities for them, right? Which is what's attractive to them. I mean, if we look at it, I think the mobile subscriber growth is still growing at about a 6.7% compounded annual growth rate for all technologies globally. However, predicting over the next 3 to 5 years in 5G, now grant you we're starting at a very low base, they're expecting subscribership to grow at 58% compounded annual growth rate. You couple that with the opportunities in private networking, the IoT capabilities, the enhanced mobile broadband, the low latency aspects of it. there's more business making opportunities out there for mobile carriers than there's ever been in the past. And I think that's where the eye is on the 5G. It's all the incremental opportunities that are going to bring in terms of generating revenue.
Yep. Yeah, we recognize that 5G is not more of the same, meaning it's not just a generation of a wireless upgrade. It's more segmented and differentiated in serving different types of customers with different frequencies, and you have a mix of infrastructure to do that between the large towers and the small cells. And are we still expecting the volume of small cells to roll out at the same rate? I mean, obviously, mid-band spectrum is not necessarily a small cell play, although it could be. But Scott, would you expect that we'd see a rollout at the same pace as we've seen in the past, or at least the past year?
Well, I think in general, when a new technology is introduced, and let me just qualify that 5G is not a technology, it's really more of a destination. There's like 26 or 27 technologies that go into it, right? But from the time that they announce it, it's generally a 10-year period before the preceding technology is actually retired. And I don't know that 4G LTE will, because they'll need the long haul radios for it. But look at 2G, wasn't that just retired a year or two ago, finally?
Well, I'm still using my 2G phone. I don't know who. I'm kidding.
Well,
I'm kidding.
They announced it, right? And
Yes.
so that's generally, so there's going to be a ramp up period, right?
Yeah.
And if you think about 5G, the opportunity to make money for the carriers and also serve the citizenry, you look at like your low speed IoT devices, like I'm dating myself in telecommunications, where low speed versus high speed data, like an electric meter or a light fixture that you want to control, and it's kilobits of information. And if you were going to do that from a cellular perspective, you can't put a $35 hotspot on a lighting fixture or a meter. That's too expensive per month. So they need to get that cost down to 30 cents a month to $1 a month, or whatever that might be. And that opens up new opportunities even on the low bandwidth side of the equation. And then as you go up to the other end of the spectrum, that would be your high broadband, low latency, which is your autonomous vehicles, which is the theory that this 5G network can do. So it's going to give a lot of flexibility to the carriers, but again, they're going to need fiber to get it done. So
yeah. We have a question from our Q&A line directed. Jennifer, you could maybe pick up on this. Provide more detail on your CBRS comment. Who's deploying CBRS and what are the use cases? Is it private LTE?
Yeah, so what we're seeing is networks like VIAVI employing CBRS in the middle of the country. And we don't have insight whether it's a private or other deployment of CBRS, but certainly it's lighting up. We've also seen CBRS frequencies lighting up in southeastern Canada. And so there are pockets and areas where there's definitely CBRS activity going on.
I mean, the PAL the priority access licenses that were awarded are really all over the place, right? I mean, it's again, I think it's a timing issue in terms of when they get deployed, either from equipment point of view or just what it's going to take to build out that license footprint.
Yeah, and I agree that the PAL will take some time, since that was just a recent auction 6 or 7 months ago. But the GAA could still be, under the general authorization access, you still have these CBRS deployments going on.
Okay, good. Let's talk about capital spending for a bit. I mean, I mentioned earlier that the major carriers, at least, and we still have to wait for T-Mobile to chime in, but in the past few years, they've been spending at a rate for their wireless networks, at least, in the order of 8, 9, 10 billion a year. And even if they maintain that pace, is likely to hold. But there's a lot of factors that go into that, and from an infrastructure point of view, are we expecting that we'll see the same level of investment at this juncture, Danny, you're involved in a lot of this work. Is it has your work slowed, or is it increasing, or is it
Yes. So I'll give you my, my perspective, a general perspective. So to get into 2021, we just got to take a look back at 2020 for a minute, where 2020 was a challenging year for a lot of the reasons I said earlier. But if you think about it, there was, really 4 carriers in the market, right? Because it was Sprint one day and then the next day it was Dish, right? And obviously, but there hasn't been, 2020 wasn't a year where all 4 or 3 active carriers at the time were deploying or spending money that we thought they would. And so we kind of held our breath, and we, held on to the idea that the second half of 2020 would be better. And that didn't really come to fruition. And again, from our perspective. And so, I unfortunately, I think this year is going to be sort of the same, where I don't think all 4 carriers are going to be deploying or spending the capital that we think they'll be spending, but there will be at least, we think, 2. And, we're looking forward to, and we expect that either this full year or at least 3/4 of the year that T-Mobile will accelerate their integration. And we've seen that now with the 5G, the amendments from 2.5 and 600. But I think once they get this integration and they figure out what sites they want and don't want, we think there's going to be an acceleration there. We also think that Dish will be is going to be very active. I mean, we might not be building a lot of sites this year in that aspect of the business, but we think we'll benefit from the co-locations from the Dish network. And so we are, like many other companies, are in the middle of negotiations with Dish, and we know that they've identified sites of all types, right, from all different tower companies that they're interested in. We've all received applications, so we think that will definitely pick up. So again, back to 2021, we think that 2 of the carriers that I just mentioned will be pretty active with us. And then with regarding Verizon, I know that the report came out yesterday, and I believe it, I hear it. I think some of the things that they're going to have to take, between them and AT&T, they're probably the most capital restraint, and really, they're going to be, from all indications, going to be the top 2 bidders of the C-band. So, that's more billions of dollars. And so that, to Jennifer's point, the C-band, if they are the big winners, I mean, that's not going to come to fruition until late 2021, probably to 2022, for my benefit at least. And so that's the whole year. And so, and I think AT&T's got to make some decisions. I think, what are they going to do with DirecTV? I think that's I think they need to decide on that. So again, I think, another year where you're not going to have all 4 carriers pumping the gas. I think you're going to have a couple carriers. And again, it would be a nice surprise if, AT&T decides what they're going to do with DirecTV, frees up billions of $14, $15, $16 billion. They become active in deployments, and then Verizon, continues to pursue deployments like they've done in the past. They've been like the steady Eddie, but in 2020, it seemed like they pushed more sites than they normally have in the past for future builds. So that's my 2 cents of just overall CapEx.
Jim, how do you see sort of the allocation of the CapEx between maybe the macro cells, small cells, fiber, and are you sensing there's a different pattern to the spending than we've seen in the past?
So, we're so far down the CapEx list in the test and measure world. I'm not sure that I can make an educated statement on that too much. I can tell you what I feel, which is they came out of the gate. Many of them came out of the gate very strong on some of the fixed wireless, some of the differentiated services, to your point earlier, and that seemed to slow down a little bit. Then they all shifted to coverage, right? We got to get coast to coast coverage. And that's still going on. Spectrum refarming, dynamic spectrum sharing technologies, things of that nature. I still see investments going there. And then the C-band being the place where we're really going to drive the differentiation. You know, some of the carriers almost acted like you would expect a company to act in advance of a major acquisition, right? They got real tight, things slowed down, decisions seemed to slow down. The hope is coming on the other side of the C-band auction that maybe they start getting back to something that resembles more business as usual from my perspective.
I don't know if there's a lot more, I guess there's always a lot of spectrum, but I can't anticipate what the next big round of spectrum availability might be that would drive another wave of deployments, given the cost of just getting through these two latest auctions. I mean, Jennifer, is there any other potential spectrum that could be made available as far as 5G deployments?
Yeah, there's 3.44 to 3.55 gigahertz that's being considered for auction, and then there's rumblings of 3.1 gigahertz up to that 3.4 gigahertz mark. So that whole sweet spot of midband that traditionally has been used by the federal government and controlled by the NTIA is now being considered for its use commercially for 5G. So there really is that need for spectrum. And if you look at the US spectrum policy compared to other countries worldwide, other countries have been using 3 to 4 gigahertz for cellular spectrum for years and years and years. And so they're deploying their midband spectrum a lot faster and really have pushed aside the millimeter wave or the high band 5G deployments because they have this spectrum available in 3 to 4 gigahertz.
When you have frequencies sort of in that close proximity, are we looking at a multi-band and antenna versus individual antennas for these different frequency bands? I mean, what's the best way to go, do you think? I mean, these towers can only support so much, right? But if an operator has these different bands that they're working with for whatever purpose, somehow there's efficiencies needed to be gained by having the design of the equipment to support those.
Yeah, and maybe Jim can comment on this after me, but the antennas typically are housed in a radome or an enclosure, and you can have multiple different antennas in the same enclosure, just hooking them up to a different portion of the radio. So it can be a relatively compact design, especially 3 to 4 gigahertz. It's relatively the same frequencies, but if you're trying to add in, say, a low band below 1 gigahertz, that's really in a different antenna element that would take up additional room.
Yeah, it ends up becoming a trade-off of coverage because the less tuned your antenna is, the less coverage you're going to get out of the antenna. And honestly, most of these folks are in the concept now of optimizing coverage, right? So they're probably you'll probably see clustered antenna elements in the mid-band range, then you'll still have your low-band elements. And as mid-band moves to even higher in the mid-bands, down longer term, you'll see switching to phased arrays with steerable beams. And that's where they are, millimeter wave. Now, that technology intersects somewhere between millimeter wave and mid-band. I think that will be a cost as well as a coverage and overall quality of experience enhancement moving forward.
Is that primarily a small cell play?
It is in today's world, yes.
Yeah.
That's what because it's primarily being targeted for the millimeter wave deployments today. Yeah.
I see small cells cropping up in our area. I'm in Maryland, and there are lots of small cells around. And I saw one the other day. It's a 3-sector array. One sector is pointing down to the street, and the other 2 sectors are pointing directly into trees.
Yeah.
So I wonder, how is this going to work? So, well, good. So let's just sort of move into our final phase here about issues we need to be mindful of or looking out for that are going to impact in some way or another, either positively or negatively. You know, the build out that we're underway now. Anything on your scope that might suggest it could be a mitigating factor in either slowing down or accelerating the network build? Scott, anything you're seeing from your end?
Well, what I'm seeing is I think everyone's getting their permitting and everything ready to go, and there's going to be a lot of there's going to be some builds this year, and they're going to kind of, what I'm hearing on my end from carriers and other people involved in the industry, and I think Danny can probably speak to it better than I can, but we'll see what works best, what partners work best. And then 2022 is probably going to start the race to the pole, as I would call it.
Mhm.
So, and again, I think Danny's much better qualified being an actual tower company to answer that question than I am.
Danny?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think, and after I just talked about, not all four carriers pressing on the gas at the same time, it doesn't mean that we're not optimistic. We're very optimistic. We think the tailwinds are brewing. I mean, it's getting, again, and I think Scott said it accurately. We are convinced that 2021 is going to be a grind, and it'll be sort of flat compared with 2020, just like 2020. But we're preparing and making sure everything is ready, because we think to the finish line is 2022. And again, it sounds like a broken record because you go 20, 21. But with that said, we think everything's sort of in line now, right? For 2022. And maybe, hey, it might be surprised. Maybe we'll get more activity in the second half of 2021, which would be great.
Well, Dish has indicated they expect their deployments to commence late this year and ramp into 2022. So I think what you're saying is kind of jives with the intelligence we have so far.
Yeah, and when I talk, I speak of two sides of the business. I speak of actual organic growth, which, one is building sites for carriers, right? And then the other one is obviously putting co-locations on. And so I think where we were a couple of years ago when we built lots and lots of sites and the co-locations catch up, I think this year we will benefit from the Dish deploying right off the bat, second half of the year, putting up their 5G network with co-locations, because no one's really going to be building sites for Dish. They find all the hangars they can hang on to hang their equipment on as fast as they can, so they can deploy and hit as many pops as possible, as fast as they can before 2023.
Right. Very good. Well, let's go out to our audience again for a second poll. Question this time is, how do you think the wireless infrastructure investment will go in the next 6 to 12 months? Just what we're talking about here. So let's see what our audience thinks and respond to some of our comments and points we've made.
Hey, John, while they're answering that question, I saw something from the EU and Europe, like asking, do we have the same problems as the United States? And so I'll just make a general comment on that since we're on that topic. I was over in Belgium, and one of the directors of Orange, which is for the United States, that's like one of the big carriers, wireless carriers over in EU. Yes, they have the same infrastructure problems. Do I have conduit? Do I have fiber? How can I deploy? Do I have to dig up streets? I mean, it's the same thing. Everyone has like the same similar challenges to get 5G deployed as well. So I was hearing that in the EU, it's similar to the United States. Different set of challenges, but same infrastructure deployment. So. Oh, yes, Orange is listening. Someone just, Orange, I think I got to say it right. Orange are listening.
Orange.
Just in a chat.
Yeah, very good.
Hello, Orange, our friends across the ocean.
Yeah, we're international here at Inside Towers. So.
Right.
So here we go. The audience thinks, 43% of the audience thinks, the outlook is promising, that there's a growing need for wireless inside buildings in rural areas. And I think, there's money available to certainly move into rural areas, and there's availability of frequencies, especially with CBRS, for potential in-building applications. Let's see what's next. 25% of the audience thinks it's positive that new frequencies mean new radios and antennas and more backhaul. So, and only a minor part of the audience thinks there's the infrastructure investment has a negative connotation, that there's a lot of pressure to do more with less. And I think we've seen some of that in various aspects of the deployments earlier on, where field forces have been stretched and the carriers try to get a bigger bang for the buck. So very interesting. We have a knowledgeable audience here. So we're getting near the end of our discussion. I wanted to give you all an opportunity to make any concluding remarks in terms of your particular vantage points and any other points you'd like to get across to us. Jim, why don't you give us your final thoughts here?
Yeah, okay. Well, why don't I touch on that last question too while I'm at it. In terms of infrastructure build out, et cetera, what we're seeing is a lot of creativity within the operators to get as much as they can out of existing fiber in the ground, whether it be their commercial networks serving businesses or residential networks serving PON type services, and using WDM technology and some pretty novel WDM technology to couple wireless infrastructure into that infrastructure. So again, getting more out of not only their spectrum, but also out of their existing assets and fiber assets that exist today. In terms of test and measurement and going forward with 5G, test and measurement is an enabling technology. It should help make things go easier. It needs to help make things go easier. It has to help people be successful in their business. VIAVI is positioning our instrumentation to be much more automated, much more simple to use, really be one of the key pieces of equipment that technician carries every day when he's out there in the field deploying these networks. And our goal is to bring the ability to compile all of the build data and present it as a single as-built report for any cell site anywhere that could be turned over to a mobile operator or a system integrator, and really trigger the check mark, the job is done, pay the contractor, move on to the next job, and drive efficiency, effectiveness in that whole process, and making, ramping new technicians, bringing on onboarding folks much simpler and much easier to realize.
Just for our own information, give us a sense of how much bandwidth are you talking about for a backhaul from a cell site using a DWM system?
Yeah, so the DWM systems are all running at or below 25 gig per lambda at this point. As we move into C-band, whenever that happens, when they start building that infrastructure, you will see aggregation nodes of 100 gig with multiple 25 gig lambdas heading to each antenna. And that's why, I think that's why Scott, highlighted the sensitivity of the fiber, because fiber behaves very differently at 25 gig and 100 gig than it does at 1 gig and 10 gig. Right? Every dirty fiber, every bad splice joint just gets amplified when you're trying to cram as much data as they're going to try to cram down those things. So that gives you some idea. The backhaul itself is relatively lower rate, although the backhaul scales to many, many end sites, right? So per end site, the backhaul wasn't going to see more than probably a gig in each because of the way the network is designed. But the fact that any given backhaul is feeding hundreds, if not thousands, of individual cell sites, that's where the aggregation of all the data comes from.
Yeah.
Yep.
What's really cool about the VIAVI system, I brag on them. We did a thing for electric utilities with a long haul fiber network, and they have a mapping system that can tell you where the splice break is at. I mean, it tells you you have a connector problem or you have a splicing problem, and it's at this location. Talk about restoration time help. It's actually just kudos to you, VIAVI. That's pretty cool stuff. I'm just saying.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Do we have a sense of how quickly the ORAN or VRAN concepts might be more prominent in the network? I mean, there's still a lot of lead time, I think, and development time to make it happen, but we're moving forward with it. And I think we may see DISH as being the front runner in terms of a different architecture than what we've seen in the past. Jim, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so ORAN will be a thing. The question is when. So DISH is going to go out and do their thing. I think they've got an aligned set of vendors there that have been doing a lot of this. So they're going with the right supply chain, I guess, in that case. I don't think, again, VIAVI, Jim speaking, I don't think we're going to see a lot of ORAN in the low bands. I think that's going to stay where it is. I don't think there's no fiscal reason to go and swap all that out. O-RAN will start entering in the mid-band, and O-RAN will definitely be a thing in the millimeter wave bands, where you're going to have to upgrade your entire front haul architecture in order to support the throughputs and the bandwidths. O-RAN becomes a viable then because you're making that investment already.
Excellent. Danny, any concluding thoughts, remarks?
No, I think, as I stated, we are very optimistic especially over the next 5 years. We think there'll be tailwinds. One of the things that this pandemic has taught us anything is the importance of the network, right? I mean, with everything that seems to be going virtual and may stay that way for a very long time, it just shows you that the demand on the network and the importance of it. And I think the patience of the G's. I think Scott said it, and combined with something I said earlier, is that it takes a long time before one goes away and the other one comes about. So, I think it's just going to take a while. So there's going to be some patience. And then last but not least, it put us in a position. If there was a silver lining for APC Towers, is that it asked the question: is how do we pivot? Meaning, how do we become an infrastructure company versus what the name says, towers, and that would be like for edge computing and knowing and understanding that. So we had some time to really meet with vendors and understand what their needs are and how to bring new revenue to our sites a different way. So I mean that was like the silver lining here internally, is just thinking of different ways to grow and pivot a little bit from just being a tower infrastructure company.
Certainly, we've talked about and written about the fact that tower companies are becoming infrastructure companies, and they're probably best positioned to do that with multiple offerings, including fiber, small cells, data centers, mobile edge computing, all of that. So we look for more of that in the coming months. So, Jennifer, any final thoughts on your part here?
Well, we've talked several times during this panel about CapEx and CapEx budgets, primarily from the top carriers, but also you have to think of the CapEx budgets for tower companies and other portions of the infrastructure. And so as we think about 5G rolling out, we have to think about efficiency of that rollout. How do we do that with the most CapEx efficiency, the best return on that investment, so that we can really have 5G proliferating? And we mentioned earlier about how complex 5G is. It's not just a one step up from 4G LTE. It really is something new. And so as these deployments take place, there have to be real carefully considered decisions on where to deploy, what market segments to deploy. And so in that regard, we feel like there's a lot of planning that has to be done that's not just a replication of LTE networks. And so we're excited about being able to offer our high priority tower build zones, and we'll be offering a few of those free on our website. But I also think that capital deployments across the entire industry are really key to the success of an efficient 5G rollout.
Just for the purposes of offering some metrics, our estimates are the carrier spend in the US is in the order of 30 billion, give or take a bit, based on current guidance. Of that, the major carriers, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, account for about 95% of that. The tower company CapEx spends is in the order of about 3 billion. And a big chunk of that has been Crown's small fiber business. So we're keeping a close eye on that and seeing how that evolves over the coming months. And quarter to quarter, you can't anticipate what CapEx is going to be. We try to keep in mind what their full year guidance is, but it changes. I mean, they may not change it quarter to quarter, but what they're spending quarter to quarter is very, very difficult to anticipate. So, Scott, you have the final word.
I'll just keep in mind while everyone's working with worker shortfalls, 855,000 in communications, 1.5 million they're forecasting in the electrical side of building a tower. Remember the supply chain, just communicate with the supply chain for the electrical and the communications, not just fiber optics, because the one thing, time is money when there's a worker shortfall. And if you can get the job done and all the materials there and you're not waiting around, it's very critical. So talk to your distribution partners. They are the vital link in the supply chain, I'll say that. And with that said, that's kind of what Graybar does, but we had a great discussion today. And I just want to thank the other panelists and yourself, John. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, panelists, for an engaging discussion. And thank you, audience, for hanging in there with us and asking insightful questions. We will take the time to go through those questions and respond accordingly. So those questions that have been submitted, we'll post responses on our website at some future date. As a special offer for everyone who registered today, VIAVI will randomly select 3 people to receive a printed copy of its handbook, Understanding 5G, a practical guide to deploying and maintaining 5G networks. It sounds like a reference book that every telecom person should have on their desk. So VIAVI will notify the selected individuals directly. This concludes our presentation for today. Thank you all for joining us, and please follow us at InsideTowers.com for up-to-date information on the wireless infrastructure business. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks,
Thank you.
John.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.